It is the stifling heat of a late summer evening, September 10th, 1950, just outside the captured city of Inchon. The only light in the command bunker is the weak, flickering glow of a single kerosene lamp, focused entirely on a large topographical map spread across a makeshift table. The air is thick with the scent of cheap tobacco and the heady aroma of victory. Colonel Kim Chol-ho, a man whose face was tight with ideological certainty, smiled as his finger traced the thin blue line of the Pusan perimeter. In less than 3 months, his Korean People's Army had swept across the peninsula, driving the demoralized American and South Korean forces to the brink of the sea. They were, he believed, just days away from final, glorious reunification. He listened with satisfaction as a fellow officer mocked the American General, MacArthur, for his desperate talk of an amphibious invasion at Inchon, calling the plan impossible due to the port's treacherous tidal flats. Kim laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that bounced off the damp concrete walls. The Americans were soft, predictable, addicted to comfort and textbook solutions. Their strategy was all neat lines on a map, the beautiful, flawed paper plans of a decadent power. He rolled up a schematic drawing of the KPA's logistical choke points, tucking it away with a triumphant flourish. It was a masterpiece of defense, designed to starve the remaining enemy forces. The final victory was not a hope, it was a mathematical certainty. He allowed himself one moment of self-congratulation, savoring the sound of distant, defeated American artillery. He could not know that in just 6 days, the tide, both literally and figuratively, would turn with a catastrophic, brutal violence that would not only shred the logistical masterwork he had just filed away, but would shatter his entire worldview, reducing his army to a frightened, muddy rabble. That sudden, unimaginable reversal is the story of this capture. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. To understand the sheer, overwhelming devastation of that shift, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of arrogant confidence that immediately preceded it. In the scorching heat of August and early September 1950, a palpable, almost dizzying confidence permeated the ranks of the North Korean People's Army, or KPA. They were not just winning, they were executing a masterpiece of revolutionary warfare. The swift, aggressive thrust that began on June 25th had shattered the complacency of the Western world and vindicated every hard-won belief in the KPA's superiority. American documents from the time, specifically early intelligence summaries from Tokyo, reveal a grudging respect mixed with stunned bewilderment at the speed and coordination of the initial North Korean drive. For Colonel Kim Chol-ho, this success was a personal triumph of ideology over decadence. He saw the retreat of the Americans and their South Korean allies as the inevitable collapse of a soft, capitalist army whose soldiers were distracted by comforts and technology they couldn't truly master. He often looked at the captured American gear, the pristine radios, the excessive number of cigarettes, the high-quality boots, and saw evidence of weakness, not strength. The KPA soldier, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare and ideological training, needed only rice and conviction, a powerful contrast to the lumbering logistical tale of the American Eighth Army. This perceived moral and material weakness became the foundation of KPA hubris. The reality on the ground was a relentless southward grind that smelled of dust, spent shell casings, and the sickly sweet odor of decaying summer crops. Kim's world was defined by the maps he commanded, the beautifully inked lines, the sweeping arrows showing the relentless advance, the shrinking, besieged Busan perimeter, the final, desperate foothold of the enemy. These were his paper plans, his sacred texts of military strategy, and every day the territory they marked off as conquered expanded. The psychological effect of this continuous victory was intoxicating. North Korean commanders routinely dismissed the American fighting spirit, citing what they viewed as frequent, panicked retreats and the capture of disorganized personnel. They saw an enemy relying on massive, indiscriminate air support because they lacked the courage and skill for decisive, ground-level combat. In their minds, the war was all but over, a simple matter of time until the last remaining units were driven into the sea or captured. This collective arrogance obscured a fatal flaw. The KPA's own supply lines, stretched thin over hundreds of miles of poor Korean roads, were becoming critically fragile, dependent almost entirely on two main coastal arteries. The idea of a major amphibious counterattack was not just dismissed, it was openly ridiculed. Intelligence reports from KPA High Command, captured later and now declassified in military archives, show that while they acknowledged the possibility of a landing, they considered the logistical challenges of Inchon, the massive tidal variance, the narrow channel, the formidable seawalls, to be insurmountable. Only a madman, they concluded, would attempt such a move. This contemptuous belief in American predictability and incompetence allowed them to leave the vital area around the capital city of Seoul and the port of Inchon lightly defended, diverting precious reserves to the southern Busan perimeter, where the real fighting was thought to be. Kim Chol-ho, participating in a staff meeting near Daejeon, had actually laughed, a deep, satisfied sound, as he watched an engineer detail the depth of the mudflats during low tide. The American General MacArthur was not seen as a tactical genius, but a desperate fool playing a ridiculous bluff. That confidence, born from initial, overwhelming success, placed the entire Korean People's Army in a state of terminal strategic vulnerability, setting the stage for the dramatic and brutal descent that followed the shock of the tides. This deep-seated assurance that the Americans were too soft, too bureaucratic, and too slow to execute a truly complex operation was reinforced daily by the stream of captured American equipment. It was the material proof, in the eyes of men like Colonel Kim, of a society more focused on comfort than combat. They had seized American boots that were too polished, field rations with too many unnecessary components, and communication equipment so sensitive it seemed fragile. This abundance, to the KPA soldier fighting with a rifle, rice, and fierce conviction, was a sign of fundamental weakness. The irony, of course, was that this very abundance, the industrial capacity of the United States, was the silent, invisible force that was about to turn the conflict on its head. The KPA's doctrine and their paper plans were built on the premise of enemy conventionality. They were prepared for a head-on clash, a slow strangulation of the Busan perimeter. They were utterly unprepared for the kind of logistical leap and strategic audacity that Operation Chromite represented. Kim Chol-ho, in his last days before the shocking reversal, was preoccupied with what he believed was the enemy's final, desperate gasp. His focus was on the south, on choking the supply lines, feeding the small pocket of resistance. His mind was filled with the satisfying clutter of administrative details, ensuring the roads were clear for their own advance, managing the influx of captured territory, and overseeing the relentless interrogation of captured ROK, Republic of Korea, officers. The days leading up to the landing were marked by a sense of almost ceremonial calm. The quiet before the final curtain call. KPC propaganda, effective within its bubble, had declared the Marines to be a spent force, the remaining foreign troops nothing more than mercenaries awaiting their doom. This psychological conditioning meant that when the first reports of a massive naval presence began to filter in from the West Coast, they were either dismissed as exaggeration or attributed to a desperate diversionary tactic designed to pull forces away from the true objective in the South. The intelligence reports that spoke of unusual naval activity near Inchon were, by and large, ignored, filed away as low-priority noise. The High Command, intoxicated by the sweep of their advance, suffered from a profound case of confirmation bias. They only believed what reinforced their central, victorious narrative. It was physically difficult for them to process information that suggested a dramatic strategic risk by the enemy. For the KPA generals, the war was already won. The only task remaining was the mop-up. This fatal strategic blindness, fostered by ideological arrogance and fueled by the intoxicating speed of their success, meant that the defenses around the crucial port of Inchon, the port that would soon determine the fate of their entire army, were dangerously sparse. The only real obstacle was the mud, and they counted on nature to finish the job that their own planning neglected. But a handful of U.S. Navy ships were already testing the tidal boundaries, a process of meticulous, quiet preparation that stood in stark contrast to the KPA's sweeping, confident assumptions. This oversight, this arrogant refusal to believe in the possibility of the impossible, would be the fatal crack in the foundation of the KPA's entire magnificent military structure, leading directly into the chaos of the descent. The descent from triumphant certainty into utter chaos was not a slow slide, but a violent, instantaneous fracture, beginning not with a roar, but with the terrifying, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of heavy naval guns just before midnight on September 15, 1950. Colonel Kim Chol-ho, who was several hours' drive south of Seoul reviewing supply lines near Daejeon, initially dismissed the distant rumbling as merely an American nuisance, a desperate coastal shelling intended to distract. The first, coherent intelligence report arrived hours later, delivered by a frantic runner whose clothes were still damp with morning dew. The message, scrawled hastily on damp paper, claimed that an entire American Marine division had somehow landed at Inchon, overcoming the vast mudflats and the formidable seawalls. Kim's initial reaction was not fear, but pure professional disbelief laced with fury. It was the unfolding map suddenly becoming a worthless piece of parchment. His mind screamed at the tactical impossibility of it, recalling the engineer's smug description of the tides. This was a violation of all known military logic. Yet, within hours, the disbelief curdled into a cold, paralyzing dread as confirming reports flooded in, not from the front lines, but from the rear. The Americans weren't engaging their main army. They were attacking the KPA's guts, that masterful, delicate network of roads, supply depots, and communication centers. The logistical architecture Kim had so proudly helped design was now exposed, vulnerable, and already under attack. This was the moment the paper plans of victory were shredded. The KPA's main army, concentrated far to the south and relentlessly squeezing the Pusan perimeter, was suddenly cut off from its capital its supplies, and its high command. Kim watched in bewildered horror as the ordered lines of communication simply evaporated. Radios went silent, landlines were severed, and the carefully choreographed flow of trucks and ammunition suddenly reversed, transforming into a chaotic stampede of panicked civilian vehicles and scattered military stragglers. The KPA had been fighting a conventional war of fronts. The Marines, with breathtaking audacity, had jumped straight into their soft, vulnerable rear. The sensory reality of the rout began to define the colonel's new world. The clean lines of the map were replaced by the filth and desperation of the road. The constant threat was no longer an approaching enemy, but the ubiquitous roar of American aircraft, the Sky Raiders and Corsairs, who now hunted the exposed supply columns with lethal, unpunishable efficiency. Captured KPA operational records later confirmed that this air interdiction, far more than the initial ground fighting, was the true instrument of the collapse. The KPA's armored vehicles, once their pride, now sat stranded on the shoulders of the road, having run out of fuel or been disabled by precise aerial attacks. Kim, forced to abandon his staff car, found himself walking, a physical humiliation for a man of his rank, and the transition from staff officer to desperate fugitive was immediate and profound. He saw soldiers abandoning their weapons for faster movement, officers tearing the insignia from their uniforms, and the ideological certainty that had fueled their entire campaign draining out of the army with every desperate mile. He was no longer tracing elegant movements on a map. He was sinking into the harsh material reality of the muddy boots. The descent was complete when he realized his immediate objective was not to rejoin the fight, but simply to survive the night. For Colonel Kim, the retreat quickly became a terrifying, physical manifestation of his strategic error. His entire life, his career, had been built on order, discipline, and the absolute predictability of the map. Now, the world had become horizontal, a desperate scramble across unfamiliar terrain, guided only by the distant hope of reaching the 38th parallel. The chaos wasn't merely tactical, it was deeply moral. He watched as the tight, ideological cohesion of the KPA snapped under the pressure of starvation and the ceaseless American air attacks. Soldiers, once proud and disciplined, turned quickly feral, looting civilian homes for food, discarding their heavy, official gear, the symbols of their fighting pride, for the sake of speed. The rhythmic cadence of marching columns was replaced by the hollow, disorganized shuffling of muddy boots, a sound that carried the weight of defeat more profoundly than any enemy cheer. The immediate objective of the Americans wasn't to fight the KPA army head-on. It was to starve it, to turn it into a disorganized mob. The Marines were advancing rapidly inland from Inchon, seizing Seoul, and, more importantly, cutting the main supply conduits that fed the bulk of the KPA forces still locked in combat near Busan. Captured KPA field reports later revealed that within the first week of the landing, food and ammunition resupply fell to less than 10% of pre-landing requirements for units in the south. This was the silent internal warfare that shattered the KPA. Colonel Kim, traveling by night and hiding in ditches and under bridges during the day, saw firsthand the terrifying efficacy of this strategy. He witnessed his own officers, men he had shared confident laughter with just days before, begging local farmers for a handful of sweet potatoes. The contrast between the rigid, victorious image of the army captured in photographs just a week prior and the desperate, scavenging reality he now inhabited was a searing humiliation. The constant, chilling presence of American air power enforced the new reality. Any aggregation of troops larger than a handful of men, any truck daring to move in daylight, was instantly targeted by the low-flying, screaming fighter planes. The air became an enemy territory, turning the simple act of movement into an act of terrifying risk. Kim, a man accustomed to directing troop movements from a comfortable chair, found himself hugging the cold, damp earth, listening to the horrifying shriek of rockets, followed by the deafening crump of explosions just yards away. His faith in the unfolding map was gone, replaced by an obsession with the nearest tree line or creek bed, the only elements of the earth that now offered any reliable form of protection. He understood with a sickening clarity that the American generals had not just outmaneuvered them, they had fundamentally humiliated them. They had turned the KPA's greatest strength, its position deep in the south, into its fatal weakness. The long road north became a forced education in survival, a harrowing, immediate lesson that shattered his ideological armor and propelled him toward the bitter routine of life as a prisoner. The moment of capture for Colonel Kim Chol-ho was not a dramatic confrontation, but a moment of sheer, freezing exhaustion. He was found huddled in a farmer's abandoned pig pen, miles north of Seoul, his boots caked with the thick, humiliating residue of the retreat, the muddy boots motif now complete and utterly permanent. The American patrol, a group of young, tired infantrymen, treated him with a detached professionalism that was more unsettling than outright cruelty. Within days, the ideological fever pitch of the rout was replaced by the low, grating hum of prisoner life at a temporary holding facility near Inchon. This new reality, the routine, was defined by an acute scarcity that contrasted ironically with the American abundance that surrounded them. Kim, stripped of his uniform insignia and his rank, was now just a number, another face in the long line of defeated men. The days quickly dissolved into a monotonous sequence of cold, hunger, and waiting. The physical environment was a simple, barbed wire cage carved out of an unused military depot, perpetually smelling of kerosene, damp earth, and disinfectant. But the real suffering was internal, a psychological grinding that replaced the adrenaline of the retreat. He had to grapple with the profound humiliation of having been right, then wrong. He had scorned the American reliance on material goods. Now, his very existence depended on them. The thin, scratchy U.S. Army blankets, the processed flour of the rations, the sheer mechanical efficiency with which his captors managed thousands of defeated soldiers. This was the true psychological torture. Recognizing that the enemy's system, which he had so contemptuously dismissed as decadent, was proving to be a highly effective industrial machine capable not just of war, but of organization on a scale the KPA could never match. The small acts of defiance became the only anchors in this routine. Men would gather in hushed groups, carefully peeling the labels off cans of food to use the wax paper for clandestine notes or drawing detailed, tiny maps, a desperate, futile return to the structure of the unfolding map, now reduced to a scrap of trash. Humor, that essential, absurd release valve, often surfaced around the food. Kim overheard a sergeant bitterly joking that the American rations, with their strange powders and tinned meats, tasted exactly like the victory they thought they were going to have, bland and strangely synthetic. These brief flashes of dark levity were vital. They were the tiny ways men fought against the emotional numbness enforced by the wire. Kim found himself obsessively watching the American guards, not out of hostility, but out of professional curiosity. He studied their shift changes, their patrol patterns, the way they handled their weapons. The officer inside him could not be entirely extinguished. Even in captivity, he was seeking order and vulnerability in the structure of his new world, trying to mentally redraw the lines of conflict, even as his physical map was reduced to a small, dusty patch of ground. This relentless observation and attempt to find a flaw in the system was his private, internal battle against the crushing, demoralizing sameness of the prison compound. The most insidious part of the confinement was not the physical hunger, but the psychological erosion caused by the endless, humiliating spectacle of American logistical superiority. For Colonel Kim, who had been trained to view the Americans as a soft and operationally clumsy force, the sight of the camp running with clean, cold efficiency was profoundly demoralizing. He watched as trucks arrived precisely on schedule, delivering thousands of meals without fail, as engineers methodically repaired fences, and as medics treated every wound, no matter how minor. This was the antithesis of the chaotic, breakdown-prone supply chain he had been used to running. The American system, which he had dismissed as over-engineered, was proving to be a perfect, relentless machine, capable of sustaining itself indefinitely. The small acts of cruelty and sadism that sometimes characterize prison guards were less damaging than the sheer, overwhelming evidence of the enemy's competence. The emotional core of the KPA prisoners coalesced around silent acts of resistance. Though they were forbidden from singing their national anthems, small groups would meet in the corners of the compound, rehearsing the complex stanzas in near whispers, their heads bowed, transforming the lyrics into a shared spiritual defiance. Others, like Kim, resorted to the mental game of the unfolding map, recreating the entire Korean peninsula in their minds, debating the theoretical strategies that could have saved them, tracing imaginary lines that bypassed Inchon and Seoul. It was an intellectual exercise, a futile attempt to regain control over the one thing the Americans couldn't seize, their minds. Kim would spend hours meticulously reviewing the initial attack plans, searching for the single flaw in the paper plans that had led them to this muddy, fenced-in existence. He eventually realized the fatal error wasn't in the attack on Busan, but in the psychological contempt that led them to ignore Inchon. The Americans had broken their operational rules precisely because they knew the KPA would assume they wouldn't. Brief moments of dark humor pierced the gray monotony. One evening, a younger private managed to steal a large tin of American coffee grounds, which was impossible to brew. Instead, he and 3 other men pretended to hold a formal ceremony, passing the open tin around, each man inhaling the rich, forbidden aroma of luxury and complaining about the smell of freedom. Kim, watching from a distance, saw the painful, fragile humanity in this gesture, a moment of shared, imagined richness in the face of absolute material deprivation. But the most important shift was the gradual, grudging respect the prisoners developed for the American soldier. Stripped of propaganda, Kim saw the guards were simply professionals, trained, well-fed, and ruthlessly efficient in their duties. The muddy boots of the vanquished now contrasted with the surprisingly clean, leather boots of the victors, symbolizing a fundamental, terrifying difference in national capacity. This slow, agonizing recognition that the enemy was neither soft nor clumsy, but simply better supplied and more strategically daring, was the quiet, emotional climax of the routine, a prelude to the necessary, life-altering confrontation that was waiting for him at the next stage of his captivity. The true turning point in Colonel Kim's captivity arrived not through physical hardship, but through a cold, clinical confrontation in a small, windowless interrogation room. He was brought before an American officer, not a military intelligence specialist interested in deployments or troop numbers, but a psychological warfare expert fluent in Korean, who seemed interested only in the why of the collapse. The room was aggressively tidy, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and clean paper, a deliberate contrast to the chaos of the rout. The American, an older major named Evans, never raised his voice, never threatened, but simply laid out the factual chronology of the war's reversal, turning the narrative of victory into a damning case file of KPA failure. Major Evans didn't mock Kim's loyalty. He attacked the foundation of his professional pride. He presented aerial photographs, crisp, shocking images of the chaos on the KPA's main supply routes south of Seoul, showing the abandoned trucks, the columns of exhausted men, and the precision of American airstrikes. This was the visual counter-argument to the unfolding map, a brutal reality check rendered in high-resolution detail. Evans then calmly explained the intelligence failures that led the KPA High Command to dismiss Inchon, citing Kim's own internal documents which described the American forces as predictable and soft. This was the moment the major stripped away Kim's last defense, the belief that the failure was tactical, not fundamental. The ultimate moral test came when Evans placed a small, simple item on the table, a new, sturdy U.S. Army boot, surprisingly clean, a perfect symbol of the enemy's endless logistical depth. "Colonel," Evans said quietly, gesturing to the colonel's own battered, mud-crusted footwear, the permanent muddy boots of defeat. "You told your men that Americans were weak because they needed these. We needed them because we could make them. We made millions. You could only make a few thousand. Which man is truly strong? The one who can fight a lifetime on a single pair, or the one who fights knowing a fresh pair is always one day's journey away?" This wasn't a question of ideology, it was a question of industrial reality. It was a professional challenge, forcing Kim to acknowledge that his enemy's apparent decadence was, in fact, an industrial engine of war, so powerful it could absorb any logistical setback and project overwhelming force across oceans. The encounter was a revelation that went beyond military intelligence. It forced Kim to confront the fact that his entire belief system, his paper plans of revolutionary victory, had been built on a willful misreading of the enemy's capability. He realized that the contemptuous laughter he had shared with his fellow generals about Inchon was not a sign of tactical brilliance, but a collective act of strategic suicide. The humiliation wasn't in being captured, it was in realizing the enemy had defeated his idea of war long before they defeated his army. This profound internal shift, recognizing the scale and depth of the American commitment, was the single most difficult truth he would ever face. It was a truth that had to be communicated somehow to the desperate men still fighting. But the next stage of his captivity would offer a startling, physical chance to resolve the deep tension of his failure. Major Evans, sensing the crack in Kim's ideological armor, leaned back and allowed the silence to deepen. He wasn't looking for secrets, he was looking for surrender of the mind. He understood that for an officer of Kim's rigidity, accepting the technological and logistical reality of defeat was far more painful than any physical torture. The American counter-propaganda effort, documented in later psychological operations studies, focused heavily on exploiting this very difference. The KPA's fierce, individual will versus the US's unassailable industrial capacity. Kim stared at his own battered, mud-stained boots, the emblem of the defeated soldier, and compared them to the clean, perfect example sitting on the table. He finally articulated the truth, a whispered admission that carried the weight of national failure. We believed our will was enough. We believed your comfort made you weak. Evans simply nodded, a gesture of quiet, professional understanding that stung Kim more than any insult. Your will brought you to the Busan perimeter, the major observed, but our logistics put a division in your rear. We did not win because we were better soldiers on the day. We won because we could sustain the fight longer, better, and with more force than you ever thought possible. This was the shattering revelation. The American victory was not a fluke of battle, but a predictable consequence of industrial superiority. The entire doctrine of the KPA, built on the romantic notion of ideological purity overcoming material wealth, was in this room definitively pronounced dead. Kim realized that his cherished paper plans were not just tactically flawed, they were fundamentally philosophically irrelevant in the face of modern industrial warfare. This moment of clarity provided the colonel with a dark, necessary freedom. He could finally separate his genuine patriotism and his military professionalism from the failed political dogma that had blinded his commanders. His commitment to his men remained, but his faith in the leadership that had led them into this rout evaporated. The focus shifted from how to win the war to how to survive the chaos that followed. The unfolding map of victory was officially burned in his mind, replaced by a deep, internalized recognition of the American system's scale. He understood that the fighting still raging across the peninsula was not a strategic battle, but a desperate, final effort by starving men. His final act in the interrogation room was not a plea for mercy, but a professional warning to Evans about the ferocity of the KPA soldiers fighting without supplies, a testament to their individual bravery, divorced from the incompetence of their generals. Having resolved his own internal conflict, Kim was now psychologically prepared for the brutal physical climax of the prison experience, where the abstract failure of the map would be made terrifyingly concrete. His journey was about to culminate in the frantic collapse, escape, liberation of the camp itself. The climax of Colonel Kim's captivity was not a slow march to freedom, but a sudden, terrifying eruption of violence that swept through the compound in the last days of September 1950. The camp, located near the critical supply hub of Suwon, suddenly found itself in the path of the retreating KPA forces who, cut off and desperate, were attempting a ferocious breakout toward the north. The entire area became a chaotic battleground as fragmented, starving enemy units clashed with the advancing US and ROK forces. For the prisoners inside the barbed wire, this sudden shift from monotonous routine to extreme danger was jarring. The air, already heavy with the distant sound of artillery, was now rent by the sharp, close-in crack of small arms fire. The KPA High Command, realizing the scale of their blunder, issued frantic orders to retrieve as many high-ranking officers as possible, viewing them as valuable assets for reorganization. This effort, documented in later U.S. Army historical studies, turned the prison camps into contested zones. One freezing morning, the compound walls reverberated with the heavy thump of mortars. Moments later, a wave of desperate, filthy North Korean soldiers, not the polished men of the initial victory, but true representations of the defeated, carrying the weight of their muddy boots, began tearing through the perimeter fence in a brutal, disorganized surge. This was the moment of resolution. The chaos of the rout had finally caught up to the quiet routine of the prison. Colonel Kim was caught between two fires. His loyalty was fractured. He felt a deep bond with the desperate, fighting men of the KPA. Yet his intellectual clarity, achieved in the interrogation room, told him that this breakout was a futile spasm of violence. He watched the scene unfold with the detached professionalism of a strategist, recognizing the tactical error even as the adrenaline surged. The U.S. guards, though surprised, reacted with the cold, measured efficiency that characterized their entire logistical war machine. Machine guns opened up with a devastating, measured rhythm, turning the narrow gaps in the wire into slaughter zones. Kim saw the ideological fervor of the attacking KPA soldiers meet the brutal, concentrated firepower of the American defense, a microcosm of the entire war being lost. He saw men who had been reduced to fragments of their former selves, desperately trying to reimpose the lines of the unfolding map through sheer willpower, only to be stopped by the industrial reality of overlapping machine gun arcs. For Kim, this was the final, devastating proof. The collapse was irreversible. He realized that the greatest service he could offer his country was not to join the doomed breakout, but to survive, to carry the truth of their failure into the aftermath. As the immediate fighting subsided, leaving behind the gruesome silence and the lingering smell of cordite, Colonel Kim made his final, most professional decision. He watched as a handful of prisoners, fueled by desperation, made it through the breach in the fence, only to melt away into the hostile countryside, forever carrying their muddy boots of defeat. He saw others captured or killed by the consolidating American forces. His initial, instinctual urge to join the escaping men, a final, futile embrace of his past loyalty, was tempered by the searing clarity gained in Major Evans's interrogation room. He knew with absolute certainty that freedom gained now was merely a prelude to death by starvation or recapture. His mission was no longer to fight, but to bear witness. He remained where he was, a silent, grim spectator to the final, agonizing scene of his army's defeat. The camp was liberated by the approaching U.S. forces, not in a heroic charge, but in a methodical sweep. The men who came through the gates were engineers and infantry, moving with the same cold, logistical purpose that had defined the Inchon operation. They weren't heroes. They were functionaries of a massive, unstoppable war machine. Kim's capture was now formalized, transitioning from a chaotic detention to a structured, processed status as a prisoner of war. The emotional arc of the KPA officer was complete. His high command arrogance was gone, replaced by the deep, internal ache of professional failure. The neat lines of the unfolding map had led only to this dusty, blood-soaked enclosure. This experience, the terror of the close-in fight, followed by the calm, inevitable recapture, provided Kim with the last piece of his intellectual puzzle. The Marines hadn't just defeated the KPA, they had defeated the very idea of a small, committed army overcoming the industrial might of a global superpower. He had seen raw human courage break against the reality of mass production and tactical daring. The resolution of the Muddy Boots motif was found in his refusal to run. He chose to survive with the knowledge of strategic truth, rather than die in a meaningless, muddy flight. He knew the true, lasting conflict would now be fought not on the ground, but in the memory and politics of the aftermath, a long, slow reckoning where the full weight of the campaign's reversal would finally settle upon the defeated. The immediate aftermath of the battle for Seoul and the subsequent chaos was not a return to peace, but a long, slow process of reckoning, the quiet settling of dust and defeat. Colonel Kim Chol-ho, now processed into a more permanent United Nations prisoner of war camp, found himself in a world defined by stark, frustrating inactivity. The physical wounds of the war were healing. The psychological scars, however, were just beginning to deepen. His confinement became less about survival and more about endless reflection on the failure of the campaign. The humiliation of the rout, symbolized forever by his permanently scarred, useless muddy boots, had destroyed his faith in the tactical genius of his commanders. In the camp, the divisions among the prisoners themselves became a clear microcosm of the broader political and ideological struggle. There was no single, unified KPA perspective anymore. Some men clung fiercely to the ideological line, denouncing their capture as a temporary setback and continuing to draw defiant, fantastical new lines on imaginary maps, a desperate, futile attempt to conjure the unfolding map back into existence. Others, like Kim, sat in quiet, grim circles, analyzing the factual, brutal truth of the defeat, the inadequate intelligence, the over-reliance on a single line of supply, and the fatal, arrogant dismissal of the threat posed by Inchon. These men spoke not of victory, but of logistics and industrial capacity, having been forever changed by the sheer efficiency of the American war machine. Kim's eventual interrogation reports, which would later be utilized by Allied historians to piece together the KPA's internal dysfunction, focused heavily on this psychological shift. He didn't offer secrets, he offered understanding. He provided a clear-eyed assessment of how the early victories had bred a catastrophic strategic blindness among his generals, a blindness that rendered them incapable of believing the enemy would attempt something so bold as Operation Chromite. The greatest lasting impact of Inchon on the KPA officer corps was the psychological shattering of their ideological superiority. They learned, at the steepest possible price, that revolutionary zeal alone could not overcome superior industrial organization and strategic audacity. This realization created a fracture that would define the rest of their lives, the painful truth of defeat versus the politically necessary fiction of perpetual ideological strength. The true final conflict was now internal, fought entirely within the minds of the defeated, carrying the heavy burden of failure back across the demarcation line. The most brutal truth Colonel Kim Chol-ho had to carry back with him was that, despite the undeniable objective reality of the defeat he had lived through, the political line never bent. The KPA command structure, once re-established, could not and would not acknowledge the catastrophic strategic failure at Inchon. Instead, the loss had to be recast as the result of external interference, betrayal, or localized cowardice. This necessity created a chilling environment in the prisoner camps. Officers who spoke the hard truth about American logistical supremacy, like Kim, became politically suspect, potentially facing accusations of ideological weakness. His professional clarity, earned through the brutal process of retreat and capture, became a profound liability in the post-war political climate. Kim's mind would frequently return to that stifling bunker before the landing, to the shared, arrogant laughter that had dismissed the possibility of a naval strike. He understood now that the flaw was not in the details of the attack plans, the paper plans themselves, but in the collective, contemptuous certainty that they knew the enemy better than the enemy knew itself. That certainty had been shattered by the sound of naval guns and the sight of Marines scaling the sea walls. The memory of his exhausted, starving men, the permanent image of the muddy boots, was the only honest record of the war's true cost, a cost that the official narrative would ruthlessly attempt to erase. He carried the burden of knowing that his army's defeat was less an act of enemy brilliance and more an act of self-inflicted strategic hubris. His release came eventually, a cold, formal process that exchanged him for Allied prisoners. He crossed the demarcation line, carrying nothing physical but the meager effects allowed, but he carried something far heavier, the unvarnished, terrifying knowledge of what modern war truly demanded, a lesson learned not through doctrine, but through the sheer shock of humiliation. He was a survivor, not of a battle, but of a catastrophic idea. The hook moment, that moment of confident laughter over the map, had been replaced by a lifetime of silent, grim recognition. The story of the North Korean generals laughing at the Marines is not a tale of tactical bad luck. It is a profound historical illustration of what happens when ideological certainty blinds professional judgment. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.